All right. Well, thanks for joining in one more week for our study in Ecclesiastes. We're in week 4 today, and instead of just moving on through the chapters, we've covered a lot of the major themes. And so instead of taking the next 7 or 8 weeks and studying 1 week on each chapter, what I thought I would do is hit a highlight or two and over the next couple of weeks, and then finish up and move on to the next one, because we've hit the major highlights. And so what he does is kind of settle in it, settle in the despair, settle in the dread, settle in that kind of stuff. So what we'd like to do is hit a couple of highlights. Chapter 9 is certainly a highlight. And chapter 9 is a description of what is the inevitability of everything under this world, everything under the sun. He uses that term quite often, everything under the sun. And so the inevitability of the end of that is death. And so today we're going to be talking about, for the next few minutes, death, and why death is so important, and what the author of Ecclesiastes, the teacher person in that, hates so much about death. And so it's going to be fun. It's going to be interesting. There's an illustration at the end. We could look at that in a minute and see, but there's a lot of hope in this chapter in the midst of despair, and that's the idea. So we're going to read through chapter 9 together of Ecclesiastes, and I think this will be fun. But verse 1 says, all of this I laid to heart, examining it all. One of the things that if you go back and reread some of that, he contrasts wisdom and folly, and so he's talking more about how to pursue wisdom. And then the end of chapter 8 is really about how we as human beings cannot know the ways of God or the works of God. While we're under the sun's down here, above the sun's up there. The analogy that he keeps using, here is temporary, there is eternal, here is us, there is God in heaven. We're limited. We can't see beyond under the sun to what comes next. The end of everything we have under the sun is death. It's the great separation between under the sun and above the sun, or heavens. So we on earth are separated from heaven by death. And so it's interesting to kind of look at that and see from an Old Testament perspective. Again, we're talking about the world as it existed before Jesus Christ. So the teachings about death in some way, shape, or form were always connected to the idea of Messiah, which was still yet to come. And so let's continue reading this. But we can't know the ways of God, but wisdom is better than folly. So he lays his heart to examining it. But this is what he said: the righteous and the wise, and their deeds are in the hand of God. In other words, God is happy with them. God is taking care of them. They're doing right. But then there's a sense that the righteous and the wicked are treated the same way under the sun. And so let's keep reading. Whether it's love or hate, man does not know. Both are before him. It is the same for all, since the same event happens to the righteous and the wicked. What event is that? Death. The same event. It's kind of rude in the way that it comes out. From his perspective, in a great evil, but it is. Why was death in the picture at all? If you go back and read Genesis 1, 2, 3, the story of Adam and Eve, the story of the beginning, the story of creation, we don't have death until Adam and Eve sinned. And you say, well, that's kind of mean for God to punish Adam and Eve with death. No, it's the choice that you make when you choose against God. If God is life and you choose against life, you're choosing for death eventually. If God is light and you choose against God, then you're choosing darkness. It's not saying that God has light. It says God is light. If God is love, the way we understand love is we see how God treats us, and you choose against that. You're choosing hatred, and so it's our choice what happens. And so this great event's going to happen. The same event happens to the righteous and the wicked, as far as we see. To the good and the evil, to the clean and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice. As the good one is, so is the sinner, as he who swears, the one who shuns an oath. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun. The same event happens to all. In other words, he's saying that from his perspective, before death, it seems evil that death comes on everybody. And essentially, death in itself is a result of evil things, evil choices, sin. And so then he says, the fact that this event happens to all the hearts of the children of man are full of evil, madness in their hearts while they live, but after that they go to the dead. So he says there's some sin in all these places, and then we all die. So we sin and then we die. That's his point. But in the midst of that, we try to work for wisdom and for righteousness. And then he said, but he who's joined with all the living has hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. So he's saying that from our perspective, again, from the perspective under the sun, which is not to be glorified. Go back to chapter 3. It's not saying the way it should be. It's saying the way it is, the way it appears even. Better to be alive than to be dead. For the living at least know they'll die, but the dead know nothing. They have no more reward. This is from the perspective of under the sun. For the memory of them is forgotten. Their love and their hate, their envy have already perished. And forever they have no more share in all that's done under the sun. So he says this is temporary. You have your opportunity to change things. Take it seriously, make the best of it, because that opportunity is going to go away. There's going to be a time when you don't do anything else. Your chance to share with the things that happen on this earth are going to be over. What are you going to do with that? And so his perspective on that is really simple. And it is based in Proverbs, where to eat, drink, and be merry. But he says, go eat your bread with joy. Drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. In other words, the things that happen to us are things that happen with the approval of God in some way, shape, or form, that God is allowing things like this to exist down here. So go ahead and do some of that. Do what you need to do. Let your garments always be white, I think is an indication of not mourning, not sackcloth, but a celebration, something you'd put on for a wedding example. Let not oil be lacking on your head. In other words, if you're ready to go out, you'd prepare yourself to go out. Then enjoy your life with the wife whom you love. All the days of your vain life. Enjoy the days of your vain life. You may not know what the meaning of it is. Don't worry about it. Just enjoy it. Okay? And so I love that part, all the days of your vain life, because that's what he's given to us. Work, life are a gift from God. Even if there's good and there's bad, God gives and God takes away. There's still a gift from him. And then he says that's your portion in life and your toil at which you toil under the sun. So this is the climax of that whole section. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. The despair about the lack of meaning in life is not an excuse to not do anything. It's not an excuse to not care. It's not an excuse not to love your neighbor with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love the Lord your God. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's not an excuse not to do those things. Do them anyway. Do them well. And we're not going to understand the full extent of how that turns out until after this life, and we'll talk about that in a minute. He says, for there's no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you're going. Sheol's being the darkness, the sleeping place, the depths of the sea. Referred to as Sheol. Again, we're talking about an Old Testament idea of what happens when you die. Our idea of what happens when we die is based mostly on the New Testament, Jesus saying, I'm going to prepare a place for you. Well, Jesus hadn't said that yet. And so we have this place that you're going to a deep, dark place. And again, it's under the sun. Verse 11, I saw that under the sun. So he's going to quote some of these things from Proverbs. Proverbs, again, states that there are general guidelines on how life should work in an ideal situation, revealing truths about how to live wisely in this world. In that case, they're great, but they don't always work out the way we want them to. They're not just some magic statement that we can make and then all of a sudden our lives are perfect. So this is what he said. The race is not to the swift, sometimes, the battle to the strong, the bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all. And this is the great despair of the whole book of Ecclesiastes is time moves on quickly towards death. We're one day closer to dying today than we were yesterday. Some of us more closely than others, but we don't know who's who, because some people live old lives and some people die very young. And then he says that. We don't know, man does not know his time. But the idea of chance, he sees as wrong, as bad. The good things happening to bad people, bad things happening to good people, is the way life works. And he yearns, I think, for a place where that's not true. And one of the things we see about heaven is pictured in Revelation, it's pictured in Jesus talks, is time is not an issue. There's no more sun, so there's no more repetition of the daily cycle. Time is just, we're there, we're present. We don't need to count anymore. And then chance is not there either. There's no pain, sickness doesn't come, and we don't know who's going to get sick and who's not sick. And so, I think there's this yearning for this other world. And then he says, this is how he pictures death. Fish taken in an evil net. And fish kind of wandering around, looking about, doing whatever fish do. And all of a sudden, boom, they're gone. Okay, that's death. Like birds that are caught in a snare. He didn't even call it a net. He calls it an evil net. Birds caught in a snare. So the children of man are snared at an evil time. That's death. Snared at an evil time. When it suddenly falls upon them again. Life in the garden did not have death. God's plan for us is that there be no death. God's restoration of that plan in the new city, the city of Jerusalem, is no more death, no more separation. And then he gives us an example and illustration. I love this. So we're going to spend the next few minutes in verses 13 through 16. And I want you to pay attention because he uses a story about a wise man that he knows. And I think we can gain from that an analogy into the future. So he says, I've seen this example of wisdom under the sun, and it seemed great to me. So he says, this is a great illustration about somebody wise. There was a little city with few men in it, and a great king came against it and besieged it, building great siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor wise man. Again, poor and wise are chance happening because wise ought to result in riches. And here's somebody who was wise but poor. And he said, he by his wisdom delivered the city. Yet nobody remembered that poor man. But I say that wisdom is better than might, though a poor man's wisdom is despised and his words are not heard. So this is the result of the state that we're in. There's a city. It's an underdog story because a great king has come upon it and has all these siege works. Picture the ballistas, picture the areas where, nobody in the city can get out, they can't go get food, they're cut off, they can't get water. And the king is just going to surround them until they're done. And we don't hear the whole story, but we know that a poor wise man, it seems in his case, the teacher of Ecclesiastes to be an oxymoron, disagreement in terms. Because if you really are wise, you should be rich. There should be some earthly reward, but there's not an earthly reward under the sun always for the righteousness that we have, the wisdom that we gain. That's not an excuse not to be wise, and here's the story. The poor wise man by his wisdom delivered the city, so wisdom beats might. But then the wisdom is not, again, it's not rewarded. Why? Because of the poverty. And so what he says is, the wisdom is better than might, though the poor man's wisdom is despised and his words are not heard. So he saved the city, and the city rejected him for it, which seems odd to me. If he saved the city, wouldn't he be a hero? But he was poor. It's oftentimes true in life that people don't want to be helped by someone who they believe to be under them or less than them. To have somebody great come along and offer you advice is wonderful. Hey, let's sit down and take financial advice from one of these very wealthy people. What stock should I invest in? We'd sit down and do that. But poverty in and of itself is something that in many ways in our societies look down on, even though a lot of the great heroes of our faith were poor. Jesus himself had not a pillow to lay his head, son of a carpenter. That's interesting. A poor wise man was he who saved a city, the city of Jerusalem. And yet, what does it say about Jesus? He was despised and rejected by the powerful of that day. I think this very much is an analogy looking forward to the Messiah. When you talk about death, in the Bible's connected to, in the Old Testament, to the idea of a Messiah in many ways. Here he says, all right, so there was a king with all of his siege works built against this supports an underdog story. Evil in this world sometimes seems to be the rich king, the Herod of the day, killing all the babies. But there was found in it a poor wise man, Jesus, poor by earthly standards, born in a manger, announced to the shepherds. Right? Okay, and yet by his wisdom, by his living rightly, by his righteousness, he saved the city, saving Jerusalem, saving the new Jerusalem. Read into that how you will, that's how I read it. And yet, he says, nobody, at least the people in the city, didn't remember the poor man. And they say he was despised and rejected. Well, that's the story of Jesus. And while we can say, well, did the author of Ecclesiastes have Jesus in mind? Perhaps not, but God inspired it. Did God have Jesus in mind? Absolutely so. Because all of the Old Testament points to Jesus. Jesus is the cross of the story, the crux of the story, the middle of the story, the hinge upon which all of this rides. He is the connection to take us beyond death into eternal life. He is the connection to take us from the world that's cursed now to the world to come that will not have a curse. To take us from the situation now where we have to work for a living to one where we won't, to one where there's pain now in childbirth to one there's not. It's the whole restoration of Adam and Eve. The despair the author of Ecclesiastes feels is as a result of the curse in Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3 at the beginning. They were talking about Adam and Eve. Jesus is the correction to the curse. Jesus' life on the cross is the one who freed us of that sin. And Romans says it best, through Adam, one man, sin entered the world, but then through Jesus, sin was erased from the world. Right now, the guilt of sin is taken away from those of us who claim him to be Christians. But eventually, sin will disappear. Eventually, the lake of fire will absorb everything evil and everything sinful. And so this is the way it concludes. Because you might say, looking at it from under the sun, if you don't have that perspective of Jesus, stop trying. He doesn't say stop trying. He says be wise. Okay, so the words of the wise, heard in quiet, are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. Here's what I would say. These are the words of the wise in quiet, right? This book. Read it, study it. It's certainly not being preached loudly in the world that we live in, outside of our churches. But then he talks about the shouting of fools, or shouting of rulers among fools. I think we see that when we turn on our TVs. Ooh, yeah. I think we see a lot of shouting among fools if we turn on our TVs. And then here's the finale, verse 18. So then wisdom is better than weapons of war. What does it mean? It's stronger. It accomplishes more. Wisdom is the beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord. By attaining wisdom, searching after wisdom, we find all of life's problems solved. And then he says, one sinner destroys much good. And again, that's from under the sun thinking. But we see that. We see 100 men working towards something good and one person coming along and it dives. That's the way we're living now, but soon we will live in a day where Jesus is the wise man who saved his city. And so the question is now, what do we do with Jesus? What do we do with Jesus? I'll hearken back to what we've been talking about on Sunday morning, great questions of the Bible. One of the greatest is Jesus asking his disciples first, who do people say that I am? And they say, oh, prophet, John the Baptist, Elijah, whatever. His great question to us is, who do you say that I am? And Peter had the winning answer, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God, which meant Christ, you're the Messiah, the one who's come to fix all of this. All of the Old Testament, all of the fear, all of the despair is laid bare at the feet of Jesus. Okay? And so through Jesus, we see through death to life after death. Hallelujah. And that's the hope of this world. And so Paul said it in one of the books of the Corinthians, if for this life only you have hope, you're to be most pitied among all men. But we're not, because we place our hope in Jesus Christ, the poor man, the poor wise man who saves the city. The problem is a lot of the world around us is still rejecting him, despised and rejected among men. So how do we live our lives in a way that esteems Jesus so that he's no longer rejected by our friends and family who don't know him? Great thoughts. A great chapter in Ecclesiastes. I think we're going to have one more week of this, so I look forward to you joining us next time. I hope you're doing well, and God bless you.